we talked about how God even teaches them to do that when he gives them the law in Exodus 20 and then again in Deuteronomy. He begins by saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That this is the story out of which he gathers his people and then says, because I have already rescued you, because I have gone first, because I am the Lord who has saved you, then this is the people that you will be. And so as we look through the pieces of this story, we're going to ask 3 major questions each week. First is, what are we going to learn about God here? What do we learn about the people of God, both how they are behaving and who they are called to be? And then how does this piece of Exodus fit in the full story of what we know about the people of God from Scripture? Because one other thing I think is important for us to be remembering is that the entire Scripture is the story of the people of God. It's not just a bunch of different stories together. It's one big story. And so many of the important things that we learn through reading Exodus, we're going to see show up in other places, that our God is the same throughout the entire story, and that his expectation of his people is also the same. So those are the kind of cornerstones of our conversation together. We have not quite gotten to the story of the Exodus yet. Last week we began with Joseph because we're going to see this morning that the Israelites were living in Egypt very comfortably, very happily, very fruitfully for a very long time before we get to the point where we realize the sort of the beginning of what we see as the Exodus story, which is their slavery in Egypt and then their desire to be rescued. And so it's hard to start the story of Exodus without talking about Joseph. So last week we kind of refreshed our memories on the story of Joseph coming to Egypt. And when we leave that story, we see that God continues to be faithful to Joseph, even though his family, his brothers were not faithful to him, even though he ends up stuck in jail because he refuses to do what Potiphar's wife asks him to do. God is with him, even though it takes a long time. He's in jail for years, and then God gives him the power to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, and Pharaoh puts him over all of Egypt, that he becomes the second in command only to Pharaoh himself. He is instrumental in saving Egypt and most of the world around them from this incredible famine by knowing how to store up the crops that are coming in preparation for that time. And so we know, we didn't really talk through this last week, but we know from the rest of that story that eventually Joseph's brothers have to come to Egypt because of the famine, that when they first come, he acts very harsh to them. He's desperate to see his father and Benjamin, and they go through this sort of complicated situation where he says, you have to leave one of you here, go back and get your other brother, and then eventually they all arrive in Egypt. He reveals himself to them. They all are terrified that he's going to kill them because of their incredibly terrible treatment to him, but he graciously receives them, and then the people of God are there. They all come and stay because they are connected to Joseph. And so it is through their treachery that the Lord works and ends up saving them all. And they're in Exodus 50, at the close of this book, Joseph says to them, you meant this for my bad, right? That you meant this for my harm, but that God meant it for good, that he was able to use that to save the entire family. So that's where we sort of are beginning this morning. But before we do that, we are going to breathe deeply together. Are you good? Okay. So also, for those of you who have not done this sort of practice with me before, I do like to begin a class by breathing deeply, just to kind of get our bodies and our minds settled and calm, help us kind of focus. The scripture that we are going to be breathing with and during this class actually comes from the book of Hosea, which is another story of the people of God in the wilderness. And I love this language of the Lord calling his people out into the wilderness to speak tenderly to them, to rescue them, and then ultimately to redeem them. So if you want to put your feet on the floor, settle into your space, get still, close your eyes if you feel comfortable with that. Let's breathe. Inhale. Behold, I will allure her. Exhale. Inhale. I will bring her into the wilderness. Exhale. Inhale. I will speak tenderly to her. Exhale. Inhale. I will give her her vineyards. Exhale. Inhale. I will make the valley of trouble into a door of hope. Exhale. All right, open your eyes. All right, as I said before, we are going to begin in Genesis chapter 50. This is the end of Genesis, leading us into the book of Exodus. And beginning in verse 22, we come to the end of Joseph's life. So Joseph and his brothers and their families continued to live in Egypt. Joseph lived to the age of 110. So remember, when Joseph is named second in command of all of Egypt, the scripture tells us that he's 30. And so that's how much longer he and the rest of his family are able to live comfortably, fruitfully, happily in the land of Egypt. He lives to the age of 110. Verse 23, he lived to see 3 generations of descendants of his son Ephraim, and he lived to see the birth of the children of Manasseh's son Machir, whom he claimed as his own. Soon I will die, Joseph told his brothers, but God will surely come to help you and lead you out of this land of Egypt. He will bring you back to the land he solemnly promised to give Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear an oath. And he said, when God comes to help you and lead you back, you must take my bones with you. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and the Egyptians embalmed him, and his body was placed in a coffin in Egypt. I love that at the end of Joseph's life, even after having experienced everything that he did, he says, Egypt is still not the place God has promised his people. This is the place of redemption. This is the place that he has rescued them to. They were in danger of dying in the midst of the famine. He set Joseph up as a leader who would ultimately save the whole rest of the family. God sent them to Egypt to save them, but Joseph still knows this is not the land they've been promised. That he promised Abraham to give them a land, and this isn't it. And so he says, God has rescued us. He has protected us. He has saved us here in this land, but I know that there is a time coming when God will bring us out of this. That he will give us a promised land, just like he promised to Abraham and to Isaac and to our father Jacob. And when that happens, don't leave me here. Right? That even in this place where he had been an incredible leader, even in a place where he had been incredibly blessed, that he had made his home for 80 years, he still says, God's blessed me here, but this isn't what he promised. And I don't want to be stuck here. I want to be with the people of God. And so he has his brothers and his children promise that when the people of God are rescued out of Egypt, they will take his bones with them. That Joseph remains faithful to a God who is faithful to him, even to say, I know something even greater than all the blessing I can imagine is coming. Which I think is important for us to sit here a little while. We are going to see that Joseph was right, that God does fulfill his promise, and that when the people of Israel are rescued from Egypt, they do take Joseph's bones with them. But I think that it's really easy for me, and I assume for most of us, to get really comfortable when things are good, especially after experiencing terrible tragedy or really difficult long periods of waiting where we're not really sure what's going to happen. When something goes really well for us, especially when things go really well for us for a long period of time, it can get really easy to be like, okay, this is it. This is it. I am comfortable. This is what I thought was going to happen. But even Joseph, after 80 years, says, this is great, but this isn't the thing I'm holding on to. I know that God has promised more than this. And even if it's not going to happen in my lifetime, I still want to be part of it. I still want the people of God to get the promise he has given them. And so there are incredible blessings that are not exactly what we've been promised, which I think is important for us to think about. So it is interesting that Joseph knows something greater is coming because the Lord has given this promise to his ancestors. We're going to see in the beginning of Exodus here, the people of God continue to remain faithful even in the midst of their slavery. And I always wonder, what sorts of stories are they telling their children during that time? Because usually what we hear is the story they're telling is the story of the Exodus, but it hasn't happened yet. And I imagine that for the next several centuries, when they're stuck with this Pharaoh who doesn't remember Joseph, that the people of God are remembering Joseph. That they are saying, because we know that God was faithful to Joseph, because he believed in this promise, that God was faithful to Abraham, that he was faithful to Isaac, that he was faithful to Israel and to Joseph, that's the God we know. And we know he's going to come too because Joseph knew that. Joseph believed he was coming. And so we are going to continue to look for him. All right, let's look at Exodus chapter 1. Just to kind of get our bearings here, I'll read this opening section. Exodus 1, beginning in verse 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel, that is Jacob, who moved to Egypt with their father, each with his family. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. In all, Jacob had 70 descendants in Egypt, including Joseph, who was already there. In time, Joseph and all of his brothers died, ending that entire generation. But their descendants, the Israelites, had many children and grandchildren, and in fact they multiplied so greatly that they became extremely powerful and filled the land. And eventually a new king came to power in Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done. He said to his people, "Look, the people of Israel now outnumber us and are stronger than we are. We must make a plan to keep them from growing even more. If we don't, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us, and then they will escape from the country." So the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. They appointed brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. They forced them to build the cities of Pithom and Ramses as supply centers for the king. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread, and the more alarmed the Egyptians became. So the Egyptians worked the people of Israel without mercy. They made their lives bitter, forcing them to mix mortar and make bricks and do all the work in the fields. They were ruthless in all their demands. So we see that Pharaoh comes to power. He doesn't remember Joseph, and all he knows is there are these people in the land who are not Egyptians, and they are growing, they are multiplying, they were becoming more and more powerful because of their numbers. And his own power is threatened by that. He's afraid that they will join enemies in the midst of a war, and so he says we got to do something to keep these people from rising up, and so they are enslaved. And they are worked with crushing labor. The goal of this is to keep them down, to remove any power they may have had before, and to be sure that they are no longer a threat to Pharaoh. One thing that's interesting to me here is what became the problem. Before this, Joseph was an incredible leader in Egypt. This was his family. Everybody knew who these people were. They trusted Joseph as a leader. Joseph dies. He's forgotten. But what's the real problem that leads the Egyptians to enslave the Israelites?
There's too many of them.
There's too many of them, right? And it's interesting because what promise did the Lord give to Abraham?
Descendants would number more than the stars.
Yeah.
Or as the stars.
He promises Abraham an incredible family, that his descendants would outnumber the stars, they would outnumber the sands on the seashore, that they would grow into this incredible nation, and that blessing, that promise is fulfilled. This promise is fulfilled in the midst of Egypt, even before they get to the promised land, and it causes a real problem for the people around them. Right? I want you to really think sometimes the blessings we receive, the fulfillment of the promises that God gives us, sometimes causes a lot of trouble for other people in our lives. Right? Sometimes it does. Sometimes walking in our own calling, sometimes continuing to step out in faith and do the hard things and follow the Lord and then be blessed in that, causes some problems for the people around us. And sometimes that can look like we must be wrong about that. It would have been really easy for all the Israelites to be like, oh man, right? This isn't working out for us. Maybe this isn't really what God meant when he promised this big nation. Maybe we're wrong to listen to Joseph. Where even is this guy, right? But the blessing of God does sometimes put us in situations where other people are trying to remove that threat from their own lives. If it's a threat to their power especially, it can be scary. And sometimes there are people in our lives that are going to try to squash that. And that does happen for the Israelites for a very long time. But that doesn't mean that they were wrong about the promise. Right? It doesn't mean that they would have necessarily wished it hadn't happened. Right? Don't give me this promise just because it doesn't really turn out to be very convenient for somebody else. Okay, I'm just going to stop talking for a second. If I have thoughts about any of that, whether this idea of Joseph remaining faithful even when he couldn't see beyond his own legacy specifically, or about the idea that our own blessings sometimes are really inconvenient for other people, and then therefore really difficult for us.
I think in verse 12 it's funny because it says that the more they were oppressed, the more that they multiplied.
Yes.
Out. It's
Yes.
like the one thing that the Egyptians tried to keep them from growing, and yet they grew under
Yes.
the oppression.
Yes. Does that remind you of any other place in Scripture where that kind of thing happens? The oppression actually does the opposite. To me, it reminds me of the church in Acts, right? That persecution is what actually makes the church grow. That every time somebody's trying to shut this down, right? That the church actually ends up just scattering to new places and growing somewhere else. That it is difficult to keep the people of God down. Right? But you're right that sometimes it's very painful for them. They have to endure this, but that the work of Pharaoh, the work of the Egyptians to oppress the people of God did not get in the way of the blessing that God gave them at all.
You know, Haley, that gives you hope too when, especially right now, when you hear a lot of negative stuff about the church, you know, like preachers are going away, teenager kids are walking away. It still gives you hope that, yeah, it seems like we're disappearing, but God is not going to allow that to happen.
Yeah.
So it does give you a sense of He is in control, and it seems daunting right now,
Yes.
but He'll work it out.
That's absolutely true.
I think it's fun to see a kind of parallel between, Joseph dies and the Israelites, or the Egyptians completely forget him generations later, and the Pharaohs don't know him. But somebody in Israel still remembers him because they remember to bring his bones with them.
Mm-hmm.
And so he is not completely forgotten, only to the people who he isn't influencing anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's a parallel between us today and God, who it feels like we are forgotten sometimes, and maybe we are to people in our past who we don't matter to anymore, or things like that, but God will never forget us or forsake us, and so a fun parallel.
Yeah. And that to Polly's point, right, the people of God continue to remember him and his faithfulness even in the midst of a world that doesn't, right? Good. Okay, let's look at, we're going to skip ahead just a little bit. I'm assuming that for the most part we know this story. We don't have time to read the whole thing, though I think that would be really beneficial and wonderful. So I'm going to encourage you, depending on what your sort of daily Bible reading choice has been this year so far, to read through the first few chapters of Exodus this week and kind of make those contextual connections for yourself. So things continue to get worse for the Egyptians. Eventually, Pharaoh is pushed to a point where he comes up with this new idea to get rid of the Israelites, and decides to have all the male babies killed at their birth. And we have this great story at the end of chapter 1 of these Israelite midwives who lie to Pharaoh and then are blessed, which is always like an interesting story to think about when people in the Bible lie and then God's like, yeah, you're the person I wanted to bless. It's always like, but the Pharaoh keeps coming to them and saying, like, why are you letting these babies live? And they're always like, well, the Israelite women are just so hardy and strong. They have these babies before we can even get there, and then we can't do anything about it. And so in their faithfulness to the Lord to make sure that these babies are protected, they are given their own families, that they are blessed because of their faithfulness by also having families of their own. So in the midst of this time, Moses is born. His mother puts him in a basket on the Nile River in order to protect him from the edict of Pharaoh. We know that he is discovered and then taken in by Pharaoh's daughter. He's raised in the palace as a prince. And then when he is older, he has this experience where he sees some Egyptians fighting. He tries to break that up. He eventually ends up killing one of them and has to escape to the wilderness, which continues to be thematic with the Lord, right? The Lord loves to bring people into the wilderness, away from everybody else, to experience himself. So in chapter 2, verse 23, so Moses at this point has been living in Midian for a while. He marries Zipporah. He is living in the household of his father-in-law Jethro. He's tending sheep. And in verse 23, years passed, and the king of Egypt died. So that same Pharaoh who had decided to oppress them, who had declared that all the male babies would die, he dies. So things continue to move forward. But the Israelites continue to groan under their burden of slavery. Things do not really change for them. They cry out for help, and their cry rose up to God. In verse 24, God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He looked down on the people of Israel and knew it was time to act. This particular piece of this story has always been so interesting to me, especially in seasons of waiting in my own life. We learn later in Exodus when they are rescued that the people of God were enslaved in Egypt for 430 years. And this is the point where God looks down on them. They're crying out to God this entire time. They have not forgotten him. They have continued to be faithful. They've continued to tell the story of Joseph, to tell the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And in 430 years, God looks down and remembers them. And depending on what Bible translation you're reading, that word has always felt real weird to me. This idea that our God, who knows everything, could somehow have forgotten them and then woke up one day and been like, oh, it's been 430 years. Those people have been crying this whole time, but I forgot them. Oh, maybe today's the day, right? And that doesn't sound like the God I know. It feels icky. And I think it's because it's another situation where translations of ideas, translations of both language, but also of cultural value sometimes leave things out. We just miss it because our own understanding of what it means to remember is different from what this idea really means. So this Hebrew word for remember here is zakar. Some of you have probably heard me talk about this before. And this is the same word, interestingly enough. It's found throughout the Old Testament, but it's the same word used when God remembers Noah and the people in the ark after 40 days and 40 nights of rain. It says that God remembers the people and the animals in the ark, and that he sends an east wind to push the water off of the face of the planet. It's also the word used when God remembers Hannah in her incredible distress and desperation, crying out for a son. She's been doing that for years. Year after year after year, she goes to the temple and begs the Lord for a son, and he remembers her. And so I think it's important that we recognize that this is not a God who somehow forgot these people. Especially with Noah. Noah and his family are the last people left on the planet in a boat that God told them to build. He didn't forget they were there. Right? Hannah has gone to the temple every year begging for a son over and over again and faced incredible persecution from her family. God didn't forget them. This Hebrew word means this was the time. That God knew it was time to act. Not that he had forgotten it, but that the right moment had come and it was time to do something about it. And so I hope that we don't see a forgetful God who checks out in the midst of our suffering and says, y'all hang on for a little longer, I'm not ready yet. Because I really believe he's there with them, that he hears every prayer, he sees every tear, that he is there for every lash they're given in punishment for not working hard enough or fast enough. That he mourns and weeps along with his people in their distress, but that it wasn't time yet. And maybe it wasn't time yet because Moses wasn't ready. Maybe it wasn't time yet because Pharaoh wasn't ready. We don't know exactly what it was about this moment that meant God was ready. But it doesn't mean that he had forgotten his people in the meantime. It simply means that he remembers his covenant in a way that says, I'm going to keep this. I'm going to be faithful to this covenant. And now is the moment to do something. And so this is when he visits, in chapter 3, he visits Moses in the burning bush. It is interesting to me that it's not the right time to act when Moses is born. That it's not the right time to act when Moses is being raised as a prince of Egypt, when he had all the power to just free them, or at least might have had the ear of Pharaoh in a way that was closer than it would have been later. It's also not the time to act when Moses is 40 years old, when he leaves Egypt and goes out into the wilderness of Midian. And it is not until he's spent his own, this is one thing we're going to think about later, Moses has spent 40 years in the wilderness before it's time. He's going to spend another 40 years later with all the rest of them. But he had his own 40 years in the wilderness with God just raising sheep and a family before God calls him and says, this is the moment. So Moses is 80 years old when God sees him and comes to him in the burning bush. We don't know why this is the right time. But we do know that God is never late, never early, that 430 years he is with them and that he remembers them, that the waiting is always both for our good and for his glory. So, he's coming, right? That's the good news at the end of chapter 2, that he's ready. Moses is in the wilderness, living in Midian, Jethro and his family. He's raised these children and he's tending the sheep. And God knows that it is time. So we have 3 questions here at the end of class to think about. What from all these different things, we've seen several different situations in this particular class, what is it that we learn about God? What kind of God is he?
He sees from all aspects. I mean, he sees from all directions, all perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
We just, we tend to just see our issues. But he's looking at them, like you said, he knows when Moses is ready. He knows when Pharaoh is ready. He knows when the hearts of his people, the hearts and minds of his people are ready to receive this. I mean, he even knows that, the path ahead of them is ready. I mean, he sees things from all directions.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting to think about 430 years, right? I can't even think about like, what is that, like 800 generations or something? In what we know from the wilderness story where they walk for 40 years and then they're on the way to the promised land and they're disobedient and God says, no, you're gonna have to walk for 40 more years so that your children will enter the promised land, but you will not. And so it does make me wonder, did it take 80 generations to get to a group of people who were willing to hear him, right? I don't know. We don't know what the people of God were doing. We do know that many of them were very faithful because it did take 80 generations and those people are still praying to God, which means that their ancestors, their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents were still teaching them about who God was, about the promises of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. They knew the stories or they wouldn't be praying to him. And so at some point along the way, everybody had to have continued to be faithful to some degree, or the people at that point would not have even known him anymore. But what is it about this generation, especially from what we know is coming, right? And as disobedient and whiny as they are going to be, why are they the people you picked, right? It's fascinating to think through all the different pieces that have to settle at just the right time for God to realize this is it. This is the moment to act. What else do we learn about God?
He's patient.
Yes, immensely, right? And I am continually thankful for that when he's patient with me. But when he calls me to be patient with other people, I'm just like, I don't get it, right? It is hard, so hard. Yes, he's incredibly patient, right? Willing to wait, for sure. What do we learn about the people of God? Both who they are and who he's calling them to be.
We see them struggle but stay on the path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But he doesn't forsake them, right? They continue to struggle. They continue to know exactly what the right thing to do is. Faithfulness doesn't always look the same way we think it's going to. Right? We think about the midwives who are willing to lie to power in order to be faithful to God. It is difficult to know sometimes which is the right thing when it feels like we're faced with two different options and neither of them are very good. And that living on the planet and being a human is hard. And that even the people of God who are incredibly blessed are still going to struggle and not know always what the right thing to do is.
I think we learn that we're called to wait, but to remember in the waiting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this sort of is going to get into your third question, but it's really relevant for us today. You know, when they were writing the New Testament, Paul thought Jesus was coming maybe tomorrow.
Yes.
And now it's 2,000 years later, and I think it'd be really easy for the Israelites 400 years later and for us 2,000 years later to think, maybe this isn't really going to happen,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe this is what God meant, or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and to forget.
Yeah.
But we're called to remember and to wait.
Yeah, that definitely we are called to wait, right? We see so many examples throughout Scripture of times when the people of God waited. And I would encourage you, especially if you've taken on the challenge to read through the Bible in a year, which I encourage you to do in whatever form that looks like, but to be paying attention to times when Scripture says, and 430 years later, this happened. Because it's almost always a phrase just like that. We don't know what happened in 430 years,